Hello and welcome to the Horti-Culturalists. I'm Stephen Ryan.
And I am Matthew Lucas. We do post every week, so hit subscribe if you want to follow our continuing adventures of the unusual and the wonderful in the horticultural world, which is a good segue, Stephen. Where are we today?
We are at Cruden Farm in Langwarrin, a suburb of Melbourne, and we're at one of the most important historical gardens of the 20th century, Cruden Farm.
In Australia.
Let's put a
caveat around that.
Yes.
And we're actually in a part of the garden that was designed by Edna Walling, who is one of Australia's great early, in fact, perhaps the first famous landscape designer. Do you think she was?
She was certainly up there. And of course, being a woman in that era was quite remarkable. So, yes.
Yeah. Edna Walling is part of that pantheon of early 20th century gardeners like Vida Sackville-West, women who were doing interesting sort of boundary breaking things. And in this country, there's not a huge tradition of gardens, really, from the early 20th century.
True.
So we are very lucky to be here. Thank you very much to the Cruden Farm team for having us. So, Stephen, what are we going to look at?
We're going to look at something that actually has a connection with my home, and that is we're going to have a look at a very unusual tree, the Macedon oak.
Let's go.
What a good idea.
Well, Stephen, I am so happy that we're here in front of this tree because the story is, viewers, I came to see this garden probably a year ago. I'd never been here before. And this tree is so extraordinary. I messaged Stephen and said, Stephen, what's that amazing tree in the garden at Cruden? And this has unearthed this whole amazing story about it, which is what we are going to share with you today. So Stephen, tell the viewers, what is this extraordinary tree?
All right, well, it's a hybrid oak, basically, and it was discovered at Macedon, where I come from, so it has direct connections for me. It's actually, in fact, the emblem of the local Mount Macedon and District Horticultural Society as well.
Of which you're the president, are you?
Yes, of which I'm the president. So we had a painting done of some foliage and we used it on all of our letterheads and so forth. And it has quite an interesting history, this particular oak. We're not absolutely sure of its parentage, but it's likely to be a hybrid of Quercus palustris, the pin oak, and possibly some evergreen oak. So hence the sort of semi-evergreen habit of the tree, because nobody's sure.
Point of context, we're in midwinter here in Australia. It's July, and as you can see, these leaves are very green.
Yes. Being a hybrid oak, though, and raised from seed, it does vary a bit. So there is variation in different specimens of this particular hybrid oak.
So the thought is then that sometime in the late 19th, early 20th century, two oaks came together in perfect harmony in Macedon.
Yes.
And you do make the point that oaks are, for want of a better word,
promiscuous.
They like to get around and share their love. So this tree was then, identified as a seedling, that it had different characteristics? Someone noted it?
Yes, well, in fact, the person who noted it was, I would have said George Firth, but I have been doing some research and some people are suggesting Joe Firth. I don't know, but he was a gardener at Government Cottage at Mount Macedon. He was also a gardener at Glen Cairn at Mount Macedon. He was an arborist and a forester, and he also became superintendent of the State Forestry Nursery at Mount Macedon. And he was the one, obviously, that first noticed this strange hybrid oak. And there are any number of specimens of this type growing around the Mount Macedon area. I know of quite a number in gardens. This particular specimen was supposed to have come from a garden called Sefton at Mount Macedon, and Dame Elizabeth either bought it back as seed or as seedlings. Funnily enough, though, I don't remember there being a Macedon oak in the garden of Sefton, so that may also be apocryphal, I don't know. But it has found its way around. There are many trees of it about. The staff here call it the laughing tree because it laughs at you because it drops its foliage for months on end. So every gardener that has to work in the gardens of Mount Macedon, where some of these trees are, also have a similar sort of story to tell, but most of them aren't laughing.
Well, you mentioned Dame Elizabeth, so we should put in context for some viewers that Cruden Farm is a famous Australian garden that was planted and designed and created by Dame Elizabeth Murdoch of the newspaper family, Murdoch family. And this was one of the trees that she planted. Now, we've alluded to the fact that it's a hybrid and it's got some unusual forms. So let's just talk about some of the things that make it unusual. And for me, the thing that made it stand out when I first saw the tree is the weeping habit.
Yes, and not all of the Quercus Firthii out there have as weeping a habit as this one has. So it's fairly unique. And at the end of the day, if you raise seed from this tree because there's other oaks around, you're probably not likely to get one even in a short span of time, but forever, that's going to have quite the same form as this one. It's certainly more weeping than any of the ones I know back home.
Really? Oh, and it's just the most beautiful tree. Well, I think without further ado, and this is like an 80s mini-series, we should find out who is your father or your mother. So we'll step back and look at some footage we took of the pin oak, which is thought to be one of the parents.
What a good idea.
Let's take a look.
This is a young pin oak. So this is Quercus palustris, the North American pin oak. Palustris means of swamps, but it doesn't need marshy ground to be happy. It certainly doesn't. Yeah, so it's actually a fairly adaptable tree, and of course it's cold hardy. You can grow it in nearly any climate other than the tropics. And if you get a good selected seedling like this one, you can have fantastic autumn colour.
Well, we happen to be sort of early mid-autumn and the colour is just sensational. Yeah. So what's this tree's history in Mount Macedon, do you think? Like, when was it first introduced and planted? It
would have been a very early introduction. Oaks were a very popular thing way back in the sort of Victorian period, so from the sort of 1850s, 60s through. It would have come in at some point around about then, and has certainly been an important garden tree ever since.
I wonder how this magic symphony occurred to produce the beautiful Macedon oak.
Well, we don't actually know the genetics,
no,
unfortunately, but we do know the pin oak is one of the parents.
Yeah.
So this is one of the parents. So
and isn't it a beautiful example? So Stephen, I guess some practical questions then. This is a big tree.
It is.
Obviously. So if you're thinking of planting it, it's a specimen tree, you're going to need a lot of space.
You certainly will. So it's not a tree for the faint-hearted or the
courtyard gardener.
The courtyard gardener, yes, somebody who's a little bit space challenged. So it is. It's a major specimen tree, and it needs to be treated as such. So give it room. And that does raise an interesting point, though, that this tree was planted back around about 1930-ish.
Yeah.
So there you go, you've got a tree that's pushing on 100 years old now. It's big, probably quite large for a European or North American tree for the same age in Australia, because we have a milder winter. A lot of plants tend to grow slightly faster. Will this plant live the same length of time as it would if it were in a colder climate in the Northern Hemisphere, but just keep getting bigger? Or will, in fact, because of its growth speed, will it in fact not last as long? And it's a question that hasn't actually been correctly answered here yet, because we've only got a gardening history of, well, not quite 200 years really. And so a lot of things that were planted early in our white habitation of Australia haven't actually yet got to the point where we can make that sort of call.
Interesting, isn't it? Very interesting. We looked at the pin oak, which is allegedly one of the parents. So what characteristics does this tree have in common with its pin oak cousin, do you think?
Well, the pin oak tends to be slightly pendulous in its form, not as pendulous as this tree, but it does have that look. The foliage shape is not dissimilar to a pin oak. I mean, I read somewhere where they thought that Quercus phallos was one of the parents of this particular tree, which I find really hard to believe, because that's the willow oak that has tiny wee little willow-like leaves.
These are quite large.
Quite large leaves. I think there's definite palustris in it by the looks of the foliage, but what the other parent was, unless somebody does the genetics on the tree to find out, and I guess it's not important enough to most people to go through that process, but we may never know what the other parent was.
We might never know, like Lace 2, which one of you bastards was my father?
Yes, exactly.
This is a Shirley Conran novel. I think perhaps we should go and have a chat to the lovely Mitch Burns, who is the head gardener here, and just ask him some more questions about the wonderful Macedon oak.
Yes, because he'll have some specifics on this particular tree.
Let's go. We're very happy to have Mitch Burns here with us today, who is the head gardener here at Cruden Farm, and a wonderful job you do too, Mitch. Now, you were saying just before that you refer to this Macedon oak as a laughing tree, or the laughing tree. What is that?
It's a long story, but a part-time gardener here in the 70s, George Capuano, gave it that name, and we've taken it on. It, essentially, as we can see at the moment in July, when everything else has finished dropping leaf in terms of deciduous trees around the garden.
Yes, it's looking decidedly evergreen at the moment.
It's still got leaves, Mitch.
Yeah, Firthii has only just started dropping. The Macedon oak's only just started, and it'll keep dropping until October. There's other stories of George leaning an axe against the trunk of the tree to give it a hint to slow down and these sort of things, but no, we just have to race around collecting leaves for 3 or 4 months.
And the other point you make too is that they're not pretty colours in autumn. Like, it just drops. So it drops late in the season, and the colours, it doesn't colour up. So
Nope.
a couple of negatives, really.
It doesn't colour up.
We're not giving it a good rap. It'll be very hard to sell them in my nursery next week.
That's right. The leaves don't even provide good compost.
Oh, goodness.
But it is a stunningly beautiful shaped tree, so it is well worth it. Now, the tree's getting quite old. It dates back to the 1930s. Are there any major issues with the tree, Mitch?
There was a fungal bracket detected at the base of the trunk. 2019, it was tomographed, which is a fancy word.
Wow, that sounds like something from a Western movie.
Basically, it's a German instrument, and we are provided with a 2D slice of what's happening inside the tree.
Is that like a tree X-ray?
It is like a tree X-ray.
Wow.
Yeah.
Goodness
Yeah.
me.
Yeah.
And what did it reveal? It's pregnant. It's got impacted wisdom teeth.
No, only that the heartwood of the tree is somewhat decayed, but that the growth rate is more than compensating for that decay.
So it all sounds good for the future.
Yes.
Does it though? I'm confused. I'm not the botanist among you. If the heartwood is decaying, surely that's like the lifeblood of the tree.
Yes.
Well, no, it's not.
a good question.
Should we flip that one?
Yeah.
No, go for it.
It's actually, the heartwood is structurally important, I guess, but it doesn't do anything anymore. The actual conductive tissues in trees are on the outside of the tree, and so a tree can live with a basically rotten heart for a very, very long time. So it's not a death sentence to have a tree that's got rotting heartwood.
I did not know that. There we go. We're here to learn, viewers, here to learn. My last question is, given that this is such an extraordinary tree, do you propagate it here at Cruden Farm?
We have about 7 specimens on the property from this tree.
Yep.
1 or 2 of them are showing a little bit of weeping habit, but generally, because we have so many other oaks, they're not coming true to form. Many nurserymen come and collect seed of this particular tree, but we tell them the same story.
Yeah. Yes, they're promiscuous, the oaks, so you can't be sure what you're going to end up with.
Oh my goodness, family-friendly channel, remember that.
Yes. I want to just finish with one little point about this specific tree, though.
Yep.
Planted by Dame Elizabeth Murdoch in the 30s.
Yep.
She lived long enough for this tree to end up on the National Tree Register, which has got to be a first and might be the only time it ever happens. There you go. Isn't that amazing?
Unless you live to be 120.
Oh, yes.
Some of your trees,
yes,
you'll live to see them on the register.
Yeah, well, maybe, but I doubt it somehow. So I think that's quite a feat, though.
I do too. And one last question, Mitch. Have you planted anything significant here in the garden that in 100 years' time people will be going, oh, that's the tree that Mitch Burns planted?
Well, actually, we have a copper beech on the property that was planted in memory of Sir Keith Murdoch when he passed away.
Yeah.
And one of my first jobs as I came into the role was to tell the family that, unlike the Macedon oak, the growth rate of the copper beech was not adequate to account for the decay in that tree. So it has to come down, and we've had...
So you were the one who
Yes.
Who got the
hacked
bad
down the
news.
memorial tree.
Yes.
Mitch.
But between that discussion and the tree coming down, we've been lucky enough to have grafted specimens taken from that particular tree that have now been planted out in the garden to continue that story.
Fantastic.
Well done. Well saved.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mitch.
Thank you, Mitch.
You're welcome.
One of the things I love about this tree, Stephen, is the bark and the sort of the twisted nature of the trunk. It's
It's beautiful. The tree has grown vigorously and it's sort of muscly and it's it's sort of pushed itself out. It sort of looks like it's been on steroids.
It does, but it also looks like a tree from a movie, you know, those trees that twist out and are full of knowledge and wisdom. Well, I'm sure it is full of wisdom and knowledge, being a century old.
Exactly.
Well, Stephen, I am so glad that months ago I asked you about this tree, because we might never have made this film if we hadn't have had that conversation.
Well, in fact, we possibly may not have done, although Cruden Farm being such an interesting and well-known place, perhaps we might have come anyway.
And as you can see, the house is behind us. The house isn't open to the public, but the garden is, and we'll link the website below so that if you're in Victoria and lucky enough, you can come. It's open every day during the week, and it is a fantastic garden to come and visit. Many thanks again to the team here at Cruden Farm and to Mitch Burns, the head gardener, who had a lovely chat to us about the wonderful Macedon oak. Now, Stephen, you have got Macedon oaks for sale at your nursery, haven't
Yes,
you?
if anybody wants one, I've got some that are about yay big.
But you couldn't guarantee they're going to have the weeping
No,
ball.
you can't, but they will have the interesting feature of being semi-evergreen, so they'll shed their leaves really late. Some of them actually may colour a little bit in the autumn, because if they have got a little more of the pin oak coming out in them, then they may well colour. But yes, there'll be diversity amongst the seedlings, so that's part of the fun of growing one, I guess.
Isn't it? And waiting 20 years to see what happens.
Or longer.
Well, we do post every week, and if you want to know what we're doing next week, do hit subscribe and follow our continuing journey. Stephen, what might it be?
Well, we'll do something else horticultural, who knows?
There you go. So until then, we look forward to seeing you next week.
All right, bye all.